Awesome. And thanks so much, Robin, for hosting us. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar names on the screen here. And thank you to United Way Rhode Island and its affiliate, the Alliance for Nonprofit Impact. There are so many great things happening out there in the world, thanks in part to organizations like the United Way. Um, we're going to do three things today. We're going to take a quick sprint through a collection of information that establishes some common lingo. Admittedly, for many of you, this will be almost overly simplistic, and I do apologize that you'll have to kind of wade your way through that. At that point, once we're finished, I'll briefly introduce ourselves, who we are, who I am, why we built this calculator, and then we'll dive into the calculator itself. So very loosely, we'll set a target of about 10 minutes for some introductory language, a few minutes for introductions, and then spend the balance of our time together looking at the calculator and working our way through at least two hypotheticals as we go. If you're just joining us, Robin offered a wonderful way to introduce yourself in the chat thread, name and sort of the food that would come to mind if you were to celebrate a birthday and bring a favorite food to a picnic of sorts. So feel free to participate in the chat in that regard. I'll do my best here to screen share and manage the content material. I'm working today off of a single laptop screen, so bear with me if for some reason this appears to be gently disjointed. Here we go. All right. Lingo. Need to put on the table a few pieces of language, vernacular, if you will, that will help establish the tone for how we move forward. Season's greetings. It's not quite winter anymore, but in the Northeast anyway, it still seems like it from time to time. I was telling Robin as we were getting started today that about a month ago, I had the good fortune of sitting in the Northeast and delivering this webinar to an audience in Florida. Today, the roles are reversed. I'm dialing in from St. Petersburg, Florida, and having the good fortune of sharing this content with you, predominantly in the Northeast, although I think this audience is composed of several individuals from around the country, including at least one Canadian. So thank you. You know who you are. Um, Before we begin, there are really only three types of money in the world. There's only three, and it doesn't matter whether you're buying a hamburger, a Honda, a house, or a hospital. There are only three ways in which you can use money to help do that. The first is at the bottom of the stack, sort of debt. If you borrow money and use it in a way that would be repaid later, you're using loans effectively to buy a thing. Doesn't matter what that thing is. Equity, next up in the diagram on the left here, is cash on hand, the money you may have in your pocket. And then subsidy would be money that is not expecting a financial return of any kind. And you can imagine on that continuum that I laid out from hamburger to Honda to house to hospital, that the way in which monies are used to buy things varies widely. If you're buying a hamburger, you're mostly using equity, the cash in your pocket. If you're buying a Honda, you might use a lot of debt. If you're building a hospital, you may lean on subsidy as a primary source of capital to help you build a hospital, for instance. And for-profit organizations, today our discussion is about nonprofit capital projects, not the for-profit universe that sits next to you, but for-profit organizations. If you were to stack the value of these dollars in a pyramid of sorts, it would look something like what's on the screen now. Most speculative for-profit developers use as much debt as they can possibly get their hands on to build a capital project. And they want to repay that debt with the cash flow coming from rents of apartments or office space or retail spaces or what have you. A for-profit developer will include a relatively significant amount of equity or cash that they're willing to put at risk. And depending on the location and the type of project, they may be able to access a certain amount of subsidy dollars that then sit sort of at the top. And if you think that, boy, that looked like a snowman, you'd be exactly correct. So for-profits, the concept of a capital stack more or less resembles a snowman. I'll back up one slide here just to sort of recap. A lot of debt, a relatively modest amount of equity, and then a small amount of subsidy at the top. For nonprofits and institutions, however, your snowman is disproportionate. It doesn't look normal. Many nonprofit organizations that develop capital projects can attract a very small amount of debt to support their project. And this is in part due to the fact that people that walk through your front door for the privilege of learning a new vocation skill or receiving nutrition assistance Generally speaking, they're not paying you for the privilege of being in your building. And so the potential to attract debt capital to support a capital project for a nonprofit is relatively modest, and in some cases, zero. In the middle, equity, many nonprofit organizations are cash strapped as it is and have very few dollars that they can contribute towards a capital project. And by and large, capital projects led by nonprofit organizations rely heavily on subsidy dollars. Subsidy, again, in the form of grants, a mix of public and private dollar values. On the flip side, there are only four ways to spend it, and it doesn't really matter in the world of real estate how you classify all of your various costs. They really only fall into four major categories. Acquisition, soft cost, hard cost, and financing. And as the kind of parentheticals described here, land, buildings, anything that you need to buy. Soft cost, all the professionals that support a capital project. Hard cost, all the material and labor values that you pay for in construction. And then to the extent that financing is used, there is usually a relatively small portion of your capital stack, if you will, that includes financing. Echo from Season's greetings. If your family is anything like mine, and if we were to align gift boxes as parallels to these four cost categories, financing is usually a small one. It tends to sit at the bottom of the stack. The next one on the stack is construction. It tends to be the largest portion of your overall project cost composition, and the sort of teetering stack of gifts now is beginning to mount. Moving up one notch from there are soft costs, generally smaller than hard costs, but larger than financing costs. And depending on the circumstances, acquisition kind of sits at the top of your stack and makes sort of the complete composition here. So welcome, postcard, greetings, Season's greetings from CapEx, a snowman on the left, disproportionately shaped, lots of subsidy used to support the capital project value of a building that would be constructed. And then on the right side, a stack of gift boxes, cost categories that need to be covered by virtue of your capital project raise. You'll notice something about the diagram. The snowman and the stack of gift boxes are the same height. And this is important. You've heard this phrase before, perhaps out of context, and you've sort of wondered, what did they mean when they said match your sources and uses? And conceptually, this is the idea. You need to have enough money, regardless of its composition, whether it's debt, equity, or subsidy, to pay for all of the things that you're trying to buy: acquisition, soft costs, hard costs, and financing costs. Welcome to those of you who are just joining in. I'm Russ Robertson, the managing member of CapEx Advisor Group. We have the good fortune of serving institutions and nonprofits in a variety of different ways in service of their capital project needs. We do this in three primary roles that we play. We act as owners' reps. We also act as asset managers, helping organizations make sense out of the buildings that they already own and control or lease. And then as specialty consultants, we're often involved in public policy or built environment policy and funding strategy, helping foundations and donors make sense out of allocations of capital into the kinds of projects that our clients tend to represent. A little bit about me. I'm a former practicing architect, was struck by a question a long time ago around why certain projects happen and others don't. And the answer was almost always about money. And so I spent the last 20 years or so really trying to get to the heart of that question. And the project calculator was sort of born from all of those experiences, thinking about organizations that are really wrestling with the concept of how to get to the starting line, never mind the finish line. There's a dizzying array of things that our clients need to manage on a day-to-day basis. And when a capital project emerges in their universe, it's often unclear how they would even begin to approach it. The calculator was born from the idea that if you were to go to a car dealership and buy an automobile of some kind, you might visit their website and you've seen the little slider bar models that are available, interest rates sliding up or down, down payment sliding up or down, length of term sliding up or down, and you get some basic sense for what you might be able to afford on a monthly basis. Those calculators are not in any way designed to give you the totality of all the information that you would need as you make your way into the car dealership to make an acquisition, but they are a terrific starting point. And what they're really designed to do is give consumers a bit of a head start, an opportunity to kind of walk in the front door of the dealership with some amount of informed knowledge around what the potential transaction might look like for them. And so we wanted to build something that was sort of the equivalent of that in the space of capital projects. I'll come back to this towards the end of our conversation today. Office hours, beyond today's discussion, we would like to make available to anyone who would have an interest an hour or so a week from now, more or less, Friday, March 27th, and then again on Friday, April 3rd. The idea would be that if you're curious about something or studying a project opportunity or just would like to talk about what we presented today in a little more detail because of something that you're curious about, feel free to send us an email that just says office hours in the subject line to inquiries@capexadvisory.com. And then certainly my contact is available at the bottom as well. We'll come back to that. We're going to jump into the calculator in a moment. And if you don't recognize her, the woman on the right side of your screen is Nellie Bly. And Nellie Bly will make a cameo as a key feature, a key figure in our quest for deployment of our calculator. So hold Nellie Bly in your mind as we go. Just a quick nod here to the chat for those of you coming in. Kaylin McGough, one of our partners, just posted a link in the chat to the project calculator. So you're welcome to click that link. I'm going to do the same here now by clicking and leaving the PowerPoint environment if my screen will cooperate. And moving us into our calculator. For those of you who may be trying to navigate to this point through your own kind of web perusals here, our homepage, capexadvisory.com, and then approximately here on your screen, you'll see tools, and project calculator will take you more or less to the same space. The opening banner talks about the kinds of questions that we imagined that folks could think about in their use of our calculator. How much do I need to target for a capital campaign? How much can I afford to borrow? How much square footage can I afford? What am I getting in the way of the money I would imagine spending on a capital project? The way that we will approach this, as I alluded in the beginning, is to first kind of walk through the particular figures that are populated right out of the box. So when you open it up, it comes pre-populated with certain figures that are based on a project, not necessarily your project or any specific project, but they offer a basic starting point here for conversation, if nothing else. And I'll take the liberty now to scroll to a point where you should be able to kind of see now on at least my screen the key beginning elements. These are the sort of first components that help begin thinking about this question. And so this is pre-populated with an assumed total development budget of $3.5 million, admittedly a hypothetical and arbitrary figure. It also makes the assumption that the organization pursuing this capital project has $500,000 of cash that it can put forward. If you were here during the opening slides when I had the snowman illustration, this would be the midsection. This is basically the equity, the amount of cash an organization is able and willing to contribute towards the project. The second bar down here is a slider bar that you can toggle sort of left or right. It is preset with a 30% debt financing level. And that, in effect, is an implication that 30% of the $3.5 million total development budget would be achievable in the form of a loan. Think of it as a mortgage, much like you would take out if you were buying a house. The $1.05 million here is a function of 30% times the $3.5 million. This is the base of our snowman, the debt. So we have cash, the midsection, and debt, the base. There's one thing I failed to mention in our opening with the snowman diagram. Your snowman is bipolar. In nonprofit capital project development, many nonprofits need to determine the ratio between public fundraising and private fundraising. And you can imagine in the case of projects that you've seen in your travels, some nonprofit-led capital projects are fueled largely by public support. These would be grants and other capital contributions from either local, state, or federal jurisdictions. And notwithstanding shifts in Washington policy over the last few months, many nonprofits, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, have really struggled with the availability of public financing, in part because of clawbacks and other rescissions of capital that had been previously committed. On the flip side, private capital contributions, the other side of the snowman's head, can swing kind of left or right, but private contributions reflect values delivered by donors, foundations, high net worth individuals, maybe trade group organizations that happen to support the project typology that you represent. So right out of the box, for better or worse, this is intended to kind of split a 75-25 balance between public and private. And now on our left side here, the sources, we can see how the $3.5 million total project development cost is being split or broken down into $500,000 in cash, approximately $1 million in debt service, and a gentle lean towards public funding over private funding. More of the philanthropic dollars or subsidy dollars would be coming from a public source. Related, on the development side, those 4 gift boxes that we discussed in our opening slides consist of land acquisition, in this case preset to about 10% of the total, or $350,000. A little more than that in the way of design and other professional services, the soft costs, a preponderance of dollars spent on construction. You may remember the biggest box in that stack of gift boxes, and then a relatively small box for financing. And these are what you might characterize as points and fees for any of the debt financing that's used to help construct the project. And so our 3.5 source matches our 3.5 use, and each is disaggregated in this little pane beneath the sources side and the uses side. The other pieces of information that are visible here in this opening screen include estimated monthly payments. And in effect, what this is doing is it's taking this $1 million value for debt financing and it's running it through the grinder of an interest rate, multiplying that by a length of term, and then helping visualize what that would represent in the way of monthly payments. So if your organization is in the business of raising about $3.5 million for a capital project and believes it would want to go out and get a long-term loan of approximately $1 million, you can plan on something in the neighborhood of about $8,000 a month in mortgage payments. The other piece of information that's visible down here at the bottom is an estimated building size. And this is partly a reflection of some of the advanced settings that we'll come to in a second. But in effect, what it's doing is it's looking at the value of construction and dividing that by a construction rate per square foot. And so it just right out of the box, without doing anything, you can kind of see how some of the major elements are beginning to come together. $3.5 million buys you about 5,500 square feet. If it's served by about $1 million of debt, approximately a third of the total capital stack, then the average monthly payment would be somewhere in the vicinity of about $8,000 per month. I'll also mention as a feature here that several of these key variables include a little radio icon that you're welcome to click on. And these open up little dialog boxes that explain some of these elements in a little bit more detail. Higher debt, as the flyout note here suggests, reduces fundraising needs. You can imagine how if this were 70%, all of your public and private fundraising target values would drop. Where lower debt reduces pressure on operating budgets, meaning the less debt you have, the less cash exposure you have on a monthly basis for paying mortgage payments. Available debt is typically limited by your organization's repayment capacity and property valuation. So each of these little flyouts offer some additional information that helps explain some of the nuances of each of these values. And you can imagine setting this in front of your executive committee or your board and saying, this feels like a reasonable capital project for our organization, given what our programmatic needs are. I need a private capital campaign to the tune of about $500,000 to make it work. All other things being equal, we have the $500,000. We can substantiate about $1 million in debt. And we know from our government relations team that something in the roughly 1.5 million range is available in public subsidy. And to the point of one of the questions here in the opening salvo, what is needed in the way of a capital campaign? It's partly a function of how these other cost dimensions begin to come together. In a more advanced set of settings, there are other ways to break down this information in a sort of user-friendly slide bar kind of way. Acquisition as a percentage of total value. Why might that change? Well, your organization may already have land that it can build on, and it doesn't need to think about land acquisition, and you can slide this to 0. On the other hand, if you were to buy an existing building and need to basically make simple paint and carpet type adjustments, then the majority of your cost would actually be in the acquisition side and less so in the construction side. So this is preset to presume some amount of new vertical construction. Same with design services. Every project is a little bit unique in the sense that the value of soft cost varies, partly depending on scope and complexity. Same with construction. The sort of 5%, 70%, 15 and 10 acknowledge the relationships or the proportionate sizes of the gift boxes that I laid out in the opening PowerPoint. If you start tinkering around with these things, you'll discover that error messages begin to go off, and we'll see how these work in the illustration of examples. If your sum total is not 100%, it will begin to kind of make noise at you and redirect you. Similarly, if you get stuck and just want to reset everything, there are reset buttons located throughout the calculator that let you sort of refresh it if you feel like you've drifted too far away. A little further down from that is what you would find if you were buying a car: interest rates, terms of loans. Commercial debt financing tends to be a little different than when you're buying a house. Commercial terms on permanent loans vary generally between 20 and 25 years as opposed to 30 years, say, for a mortgage on a house. On the other hand, if you're preparing for, let's say, tenant improvement space, you might find a much shorter loan term, in part because lenders tend to offer smaller terms when it comes to renovations to interior space that you may be leasing, for instance. And then last but not least here is this construction cost per square foot. This is a bit of a moving target and has been now for quite some time. Over the last 5 years or so, especially post-pandemic, there were many well-documented disruptions in supply chain. Material and labor values were disrupted rather substantially over the last 5 years. And then obviously project type matters a lot. You can imagine that a level 5 research laboratory space for the National Institutes of Health is going to have a much larger value of construction per square foot than, say, a single story, small, mostly plain vanilla box type structure for an organization that doesn't have much in the way of sophisticated needs for the building. Meet with us, meet with your architect, your contracting team as you use this tool and you're in the infancy of your planning process to help get some basic directional correctness around values per square foot. Again, not back to the analogy of the car purchase model, not designed to give you the perfect budget to present to your board for final blessing, but rather this is designed to give you a way to kind of gauge the viability of a project opportunity that you may be considering. And with all the others, these little flyouts here also contain information about, whatever the topic may be, in this case, construction cost per square foot varies widely based on location, project type, finishes, et cetera. There is another disclaimer here, I think, and it's probably right about here on my screen. Contingencies matter a lot. And there's a whole college class that we could give on the value of contingency planning. And we've presumed that many of the rates that are contained in here would need to, by necessity, incorporate a fairly robust way of thinking about contingencies for planning purposes. So you'll notice as I'm scrolling on my slider bar that this is designed to, as you roll up or down on the left side, maintain a relatively clean view on the right side so that as you start playing with these adjusters, you retain the visibility on this sort of overarching scorecard that lives on the right side of the screen. And that was sort of intentional to kind of give some user-friendly uh, characteristics there. So I'm going to shift briefly to two sample projects. And before I do, as Robin mentioned at the beginning, you're welcome at any time to come off of mute if you have a question. I can see the chat line, but certainly if you have questions as we begin to kind of pivot over to some hypotheticals, feel free to light up the chat or come off of mute, and we'll field them as we go. I shared a photo of Nellie Bly. And for those of you who may be joining us a little late here, Nellie Bly is a woman whom you may not know by reputation, born Elizabeth Jane Cochran in 1864. Nellie was intrigued by an opportunity shortly after Jules Verne's novel. Nellie, a young journalist, approached her editor at the New York World and said, "I'd like to travel the world in less than 80 days." She was mocked and boarded a steamship with 2 days' notice on November 14th, 1889, and returned to New York City 72 days later, January 25th of 1890, and wanted to share a little bit of a colorful context for how we might use this calculator to evaluate a capital project. Well, what's the capital project, you might ask? It's a good question. Nellie was born in Cochrane Mills, Pennsylvania, and is only celebrated in two places in the United States. The first is a monument in New York City called the Girl Puzzle Monument. And the second is in a display in the Armstrong County Historical Museum, which is adjacent to Cochrane Mills, Pennsylvania. But the hypothetical for today's purpose is that you are the leader of a community advocacy group in Cochrane Mills, Pennsylvania, and you've elected to build a small museum to document the artifacts that Nellie used in her around the world journey. You've just learned that her childhood home is for sale, and it is for sale at a purchase price of approximately $750,000. And judging by the volume of all the artifacts that she took with her on that journey, you estimate that you're going to need approximately 2,500 square feet of space in order to complete her facility. Her house is a little smaller than that, so you're headed towards a renovation of her existing home and an addition of sorts. So we're going to start now playing the sort of what if game and beginning to manipulate a few of our figures. The other thing I failed to mention is that as an organization, this community advocacy group, you have at your disposal $250,000 as starter cash. It is also true that you have learned that the Journalism Funders Network has an interest in supporting the project to the tune of about $1 million of capital project support and about $7,500 a month of operational support, which could be used to pay a long-term mortgage. So those are our starting conditions. $250,000 in available cash, approximately $1 million that would be available from the Journalism Funders Network, and approximately $7,500 a month that would be available to support long-term permanent debt, and a loose target of about 2,500 to 3,500 square feet in size. So let's see what we can do. Start playing with some numbers here. Oops, excuse me, $250,000 of organizational cash. Debt service approaching 7,500 a month. This might be a little high, but we might say, you know what? It's not a 7% interest rate environment. It's really 6.5, maybe 6.25. Let's call it 6.2. So we're in the neighborhood of about 7,500 a month in monthly payments covered through a mortgage. We also have a relationship with a friendly banker that says I can do it over a 25-year term and not over a 20-year term. So 6,800 allows you to take in that 7,500 a month in operational support and still have some cash left over. Acquisition, we know, is going to make up a large part of the total composition of values. And I set a loose target when we opened up at about 750 as the acquisition price tag for her childhood home. And I slid the bar, and now our percentages don't align to 100. So this is the warning label that I mentioned that will begin to go off. We're still working from a base of 3.5 million as a total, which may come down a little bit. So this is suggesting about 1.5 million for acquisition, a little too high. Try to put that back in approximately the 750 range, give or take. And in part, to get the percentages to balance, I'm sliding construction back from what was 70 or so percent to 55. And that places construction back in a range that would allow the total to, again, reach 100. At a $3.5 million total budget, we're still building more than we need. This is suggesting 4,200 or 4,300 square feet. And if we thought, based on the value of all of Nellie's artifacts, that we really only needed something in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,500, a $2.5 million overall project budget begins to feel more aligned with the magnitude of a project to support the Nellie Bly Museum. By lowering the project development budget to 2.5 and retaining a 25% of budget value for acquisition, our acquisition target fell a little bit. So I'm going to nudge that back to 30%. We have a problem now that we're exceeding 100%. I'll pull construction back a little bit. But this is a specialty museum. And we're learning from architects that for small boutique museums, they might be more like 20% of a project cost. And again, we're wrestling with our 100% total problem. I'll adjust construction back down a little bit. And now we're starting to see a $750,000 acquisition, about $500,000 of design and professional services, approximately $1.1 million to complete renovation, and a modest addition onto Nellie's childhood home, a monthly payment of about $5,000 a month, and an estimated building size of about 2,500 square feet. And there you have it, a relatively straightforward way to imagine the renovation and new construction of the Nellie Bly Museum. I glossed over construction pricing for one moment. I left it at $450. You could make the case that because of the renovation of the existing house being perhaps slightly lower on a per square foot basis, you could drop this back to, $400 if you and your construction team discovered that that was a reasonable value. And all of this, again, sort of puts this capital project potential for the development of a small boutique museum for the purpose of honoring an historic American figure and the artifacts associated with her amazing journey at a scale of about 2,800 square feet at a price of about $2.5 million, recognizing the acquisition of her childhood home, anticipating about $500,000 for professional and design services, construction of about $1.1 million, and approximately $125,000 of financing and other costs, potentially including an interest reserve for a mortgage, a permanent mortgage of $750 on the uses side, the $250,000 that your organization was able to start with, $750,000 in potential debt financing. But we forgot to slide our last bar here, which is the public-private fundraising split. And what you've heard from the Journalism Funders Network is that as a private philanthropist, their interest is in a value of approximately $1 million. So the last slide is to slip this back over to a roughly 70-30 split between private and public funding. And now, as the executive director, you have some sense for the order of magnitude of a public contribution to support a project like this to the tune of about $450,000. And you would approach Corcoran Mills, Pennsylvania, and perhaps the state of Pennsylvania with a request for public support to the tune of about $450,000. And that would complete the balance between sources and uses for this hypothetical museum project. Feel free to load questions in the chat and I'll certainly welcome them if the opportunity presents to come off of mute and just chime in. Um, so here is a vision, a portrayal of a small boutique museum project for an historic figure. Scenario number two, our second example for the day, complete different different perspective. If you'll humor me for 1 second, I need to slide this just a little so that I can make one quick adjustment here. I'm just going to revisit this and reset it and zoom back up. Okay, so I'm starting with a fresh template here. Scenario two, your organization serves adults with various mental health challenges. Your new board-approved strategic plan suggests that you need to construct and control 20 units of housing that would be used by your constituents. And I emphasize board-approved and strategic plan, in part because many funders, especially the more sophisticated philanthropic funders, will want to know that your capital project ambitions are in fact aligned with your organization's strategic plan. It's one thing to approach a funder with a series of pretty renderings and ambitious ideas. It's another thing entirely to be able to document that your project ambition is aligned with a broader strategic plan that has already been essentially approved by a board. And for an organization that's in the business of serving mental health, to suddenly make a pivot into the development of housing and taking on a capital project, that's not a foregone conclusion that a board would back the idea. So in any case, the idea here is to construct 20 total units of dignified housing. The constituents who would be occupants are on the lower end of the area median income spectrum. So this would be an affordable housing project of sorts, perhaps with wraparound services available in-house. Average unit size, including common areas, would be about 1,000 square feet each. I'm just using that as a starting place for round number purposes. So imagine we're pushing towards a target of approximately 20,000 square feet, 20 units times about 1,000. And by common areas, what I'm referring to are lobbies and hallways and community spaces and other things. Residential units, particularly in sort of the one-bedroom variety, are usually a little on the smaller side, smaller than 1,000 square feet. But we can imagine that we're working towards a building of about 20,000 square feet in size in total. Your organization has been around for a while. It has $2 million at its disposal to contribute towards this project. And so back to the concept of having an equity contribution from your organization, your equity contribution towards this project would be in the range of $2 million. It is also true that unlike the Nellie Bly Museum that we just looked at, you don't believe that the private philanthropic market is going to support you much for this. You believe, for various reasons, that you're going to rely heavily on public funding. And for those of you who exist and live in the world of affordable housing, you know the usual suspects, low-income housing tax credits and all the various public subsidy dollars that are in that general basket, home funds, and so on. So your inclination is that public money is going to make up a rather substantial portion of your overall capital stack. But nevertheless, those are the basics. Those are the only, really key pieces of information that you have going in. The only other key piece of information is that you're hearing through your connections with your board or through the world of architects and contractors that you're talking with, that affordable housing projects tend to have debt levels that tap out at about 20% of total project costs, and that's it. It makes sense if you think about it. The rent rates that are paid by people at the lower end of the AMI spectrum are, in some cases, barely able to cover the ongoing operating expenses for a property. And so the potential for having a large loan or a large debt making up a substantial piece of the capital project funding source stack is relatively low. So we're going to begin kind of playing a few of these little variables here. I'll start with the things we know. We've got 2 million to work with. And this is going to be our cash available. We heard from our world of references that 20% debt is about as high as it gets in affordable housing. And maybe you hear something different, but we'll start with that for the sake of today's conversation. We also know or believe that acquisition in this case is going to be a little bit problematic. We need to buy property in an intense real estate market, and we think we're going to pay something like 15% of our overall project stack in acquisition value. You'll see again this kind of red flag that went up because we are adding values in percentages here that exceed 100, so we need to make an adjustment somewhere. I'm going to pull construction back to 65. And that will allow us to have a roughly 15-15 relationship between acquisition and design and soft costs, and then 65 and 5 for financing costs. Good news, we are aware that because of some form of financing, we are able to get a long-term loan in the range of 6%, and that unlike the 20 years that's been portrayed here, we're able to get as high as 30. Again, just kind of giving some fictitious information here to help build the case for how this would come together. I mentioned the roughly, let's call it a 90-10 split between public and private financing. In other words, the vast majority of the funding that would be involved in the development of a project like this is going to come from public sources and not private. And there you have it. Those are the major variables. But wait a minute, Russ, you said we were going to build something like 20,000 square feet, and down here this is only 5. Why is that the case? Well, it's because we haven't begun to then work the budget up to a point where the size matches all of these other conditions that we know to be true. So I'm going to run some hypotheticals here. Well, does 8,500,000 get us there? No, not quite. We're at 12.2. Your contractor says, I can get you a discount on materials and help you save money on construction pricing. I can get you down into the range of 400. Well, okay, that was nice, but that still didn't quite do it. We're still at about 13,000 square feet of resulting product, if you will. So 8.5 million really isn't the right budget. If we're trying to build 20 units and we need about 1,000 square feet each, this is not enough money to get us there. It needs to be more. What if it was 10 million? So 10 million starts to get us into the neighborhood of the 20 or so thousand square feet that we're looking for. But again, it's not entirely there. Last little piece here, I'll shoot for maybe 12.5 and see what we get. And presto changeo, there we go. So now at $12.5 million, your organization would be in a position to contribute approximately $2 million of your cash, supplementing that with about a $2.5 million long-term permanent debt, public subsidy making up 90% of the remaining gap at about 7.2 million, and then about 800 or so thousand dollars coming from private capital contributions. And you might wonder, well, who are these private capital contributors? They are likely the same figures that support your operation. You're in the business of providing mental health. You're not in the business of developing housing, but to the extent that you can reach out to your operational funders and explain to them the value of your project, what you're planning and imagining, and why building and controlling and making available safe, dignified housing for your constituents would be valuable, you might shake few free dollars from your operational funders. But again, the preponderance of subsidy monies would be coming in this case from public sources. And those are all of those LIHTC funds and home funds and other dollars that are generally made available for the deployment of affordable housing. Your estimated monthly payment on a $2.5 million mortgage, given the interest rate and the term that we identified below, is about $15,000 or so a month. And then sort of outside of this exercise, you would need to build a pro forma that visualizes the cash intake from all of your tenants and offsets that with expenses associated with the property to ensure that a $15,000 a month mortgage is coverable by virtue of 20 or so residential units. And in a nutshell, that's the substance for today. Wanted to leave the last few minutes available for dialogue, discussion, some Q&A if it's appropriate, perhaps. So I'll really kind of pause there, and as you're maybe gathering your thoughts or questions, I may drift back over briefly to the PowerPoint that we had on the screen just a moment ago, so that I can leave us with, again, sort of the offer for office hours if you'd be so inclined. Again, Friday, March 27th and Friday, April 3rd, from 1 to 2 Eastern. If you're interested, feel free to shoot us a note. We'd love to hear from you there. Questions, comments?
If there are none, we can give folks back 10 minutes of their day. We can send the follow-up information. And yeah, we've got the office hours there. If there are any follow-up that you guys want to do with Russ and his team directly. But yeah, you know where to reach us if anything does come up.
Well, thank you all. It looks like we got one or two coming in now. Maybe. Let's see here. Are there a set of guidelines from a planning level to assume for engineering costs, project management costs, et cetera? Generally, yes. And again, sort of back into this idea of the size relationships among the various boxes or costs, if you will. Soft costs tend to be in the 10 to 20% range of total project value. And all of that is, of course, varying in some cases widely, depending on the scope of the project, the work involved, the type of project, the location, et cetera. In the case of the sort of boutique museum that I used as a hypothetical at the beginning, specialized designing services for lighting and curation of artifacts would suggest that that particular project had a higher end design value as a percentage of total development cost. Good question. Looks like one more coming in. Thanks, useful, fun, great. Yeah, Ben, good to see you again. Good to hear from you. Well, Robin, if all works well for you, I think we'll adjourn, give folks back a few minutes of their lunch hour. Thank you again for joining us and taking some time today to hear from us and learn a little bit about what we've been up to.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
You do the same. Thank you very much.
Yep, indeed. Bye-bye.